Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ika Vat. The US and Vietnam may be on the cusp of a significant upgrade to their relationship. US President Joe Biden is visiting Vietnam for the first time since taking office, having skipped earlier the ASEAN Summit in Indonesia. What significance does this Vietnam visit hold? With me to discuss this are Liou To-hai, National Chengchi University Adjunct Professor of Diplomacy and College of International Affairs WTO Studies Center Director, and Andrea Yang, Democratic Progressive Party Deputy Secretary General. Professor Liou and Andrea, very warm welcome to the show today. Let me come to you first, Professor. So we talked about a significant upgrade to the relations. What the US is hoping is that they can go from a comprehensive partnership 2 levels up to comprehensive strategic partnership. Do you think that this is possible?
You know, Vietnam is a middle power. Vietnam cannot compete with either China or United States. But Vietnam is strategically, geographically close to China. So Vietnam has no choice, right? But China is so enormous. In that case, you also need to know Vietnam has a territorial dispute with China. Over the spread islands, so that is why Vietnam is afraid of the China. China might resort to military means again, like 1979. So that is why Vietnam needs a sort of the counterweight against China. Okay. This is number one.
Which is
number
the
two
US.
is also the ASEAN way. ASEAN one is also seek a counterweight against big powers each other.
Okay, so you think it is possible?
So it is possible, but not definitely.
Yes.
Because you know the current Vietnam Secretary General Andrea Yang, he is a kind of more ideologically close to China, because both China and Vietnam are communist states. So in that case, it's up to Vietnam whether Vietnam wants to have a better relationship with China over the United States, or Vietnam wants to really serve as balancer between the 2 superpowers.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the relationship, Andrea, between Vietnam and China, but let's look at why Vietnam is important for the US and right now. Why is this trip happening by, the visit by Biden for the very first time in his presidency?
Both China and US is trying to make a new page for history in Indo-Pacific. And things have become very complicated and different after Ukraine-Russian war. The US is making a lot of high-level visits to Asian countries and exchange high-level visit in Washington as well. So we see that the US is ambitiously trying to become more engaged with Asian leaders. This is a very strong message to China that the US is aiming to building closer diplomatic and relations. And also we see military cooperation as well. So all this increase of defense budgets in Philippines, in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, they come to the almost highest in their own country's budget histories.
So is Vietnam perhaps one of the later pieces of the jigsaw?
Yes.
And is that why it's significant now?
It is. It is. The US government is clearly trying to build up bilateral relations with each Asian countries. And especially that Vietnam is a very important trade partner to the US as well. Not to mention that a lot of people are estimating that Vietnam might be able to replace China as a world manufacturing place. So the importance of Vietnam is not just its geographic relations with China or the US, but also the economic engagements is also a very important element and factors to determine the Vietnam's relations with these 2 big superpowers.
And Professor Liou, obviously there's high strategic alignment in the South China Sea between Vietnam and the US.
For the United States or for the Vietnam, both needs to maintain this kind of strategic relationship. For Vietnam, this serves as a very important counterweight against China. For the United States, this is US is also called encirclement against China's rise. So both are very important in this regard.
And Andrea, of course, we must also talk about Vietnam's human rights record. And this obviously is something that the Biden administration, Biden himself, is very keen to protect human rights. And, you know, we are talking about, as Professor mentioned, a communist state, a one-party state, which has cracked down on activism, on freedom of speech, religious freedom, that sort of thing.
Yes, it is an important topic for value systems. I'm sure that the U.S. Is trying. The U.S. government is also trying to make emphasis on human rights, democracy, and freedom everywhere in the world.
Do you think it will stand in the way of, you know, a deepening relationship with?
It's tricky.
Yeah. Should it stand in the way?
It would be. We will need more time for observation in this case, because this is not a common thing to mention to the Vietnamese government. So we would need to have more time for observation in the upcoming months, whether there would be further real actions or indicators in this regard.
And Professor Liou, let's dig a bit deeper into what Vietnam would get out of, you know, an upgraded relationship. What would it get from the U.S.? You've talked about the military or the security benefits, obviously, of having the counterweight in the South China Sea. What else is Vietnam interested in?
Actually, for Vietnam, the most important one actually is economic interest, because Vietnam now actually has served as a sort of the interface state between the United States and China. You know, 70% of the Vietnam's imports from China. On the other hand, 25% of Vietnam's exports to the United States. And then U.S. Vietnam's biggest source of the trade surplus, while China is Vietnam's biggest source of the deficit. So why? Because China, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, even American companies now are using Vietnam as manufacturing hub, produce their products, exported to the United States, EU, and other regions. So Vietnam has partially replaced China's role as a manufacturer hub of the world. So in that case, Vietnam needs to have a positive relationship with the United States strategically, and more importantly, to reserve that export market for Vietnam in order to maintain its economic vitality.
Let's talk about semiconductors, because this is a very interesting area, and there's prospects, isn't there, of the US investing in Vietnam's industry, semiconductor industry, to rival China.
Yes, this is a very important indicator for the U.S. to think or consider and to make Vietnam a more important strategic partner. Semiconductor is surely a very hit topic in recent years. That other than Taiwan, whether Vietnam would become the next country to provide sufficient and significant amount of semiconductor to the world intelligence industries, that or motor industries, that would be a very interesting starting point. And also the new U.S. embassy is on the way. So we see that the U.S. is putting a lot of efforts to make Vietnam's strategic role both important in the economic aspects and also in the strategic aspects as well.
And then going further on that, Professor, you know, Vietnam is said to be possibly the fastest growing economy, Asian economy, to 2035, possibly looking at 7 to 8% growth per annum rates. It's got a population of 100 million, very young population, all highly literate, maybe just need to be upskilled a little bit better. But, you know, for example, Apple, you know, moving away from China, is expanding in Vietnam as well as India. some analysts are saying that the time has come for Vietnam, that it's on the cusp of a huge rise.
Sure. I think Vietnam has already reached its goal as a smartphone production hub, in particular Samsung. And then also you mentioned about Apple, now is another one. So then Vietnam actually is keen to become a semiconductor manufacturer hub. U.S. actually is taking advantage of the chip industry as a leverage to get Vietnam to enter into this comprehensive strategic partnership, because Vietnam is very eager to get this semiconductor industry. That is why Modi went to the United States first and got this from the United States first. And then, so that is why Biden is coming to Vietnam. Hopefully he can get what he wants. But Vietnam is short of the skilled labor. And also Vietnam is not so well as the Indians. Indians good at software, IT software, and also plus English. So that is why Vietnam tried very hard to get from South Korea. And South Korea now, semiconductor is not very vibrant at this moment. So South Korea refused to offer that. So that is why. So this is very important timing for the United States to reach its goal.
Okay, right. So you're saying that on the Vietnamese side, they also see that they need this significant investment from the US at this point to enable that growth.
Yes, very important. Now already Intel set up the factory for chips, but primarily is packaging and testing. But Vietnam wants to upgrade to a manufacturing hub.
Okay, thank you. To learn more about Vietnam's relations with the US and China, my next guest is Jonathan London, an Associate Professor of Global Political Economy, Asia at the Leiden Institute of Area Studies in the Netherlands. London is a leading expert in contemporary Vietnam. Let's take a look.
I think the most important consideration we need to address is these are countries that have really closely aligned strategic interests. I mean, this is one of the great ironies here. The United States and Vietnam, nearly 50 years after the end of the conflict involving the US and Vietnam, in terms of, for example, the maritime disputes in Southeast Asia's maritime areas, the US and Vietnam are very closely aligned in their interest in a more rules-based order. The United States remains Vietnam's most important export market, and that will not change.
You mentioned the Vietnam War. Of course, this year is the 50th anniversary of those peace accords between the US and the Vietnamese in Paris. So there is a big push. Do you think they will upgrade to a strategic partnership?
Antony Blinken really stressed that he'd like to see Vietnam at least make a bit more progress on matters that, the US has been historically concerned about. After all, this is, a country that, despite its many strengths, still could benefit from addressing some issues in the area of press freedoms and civil society and things of this nature. So I do think there are those kinds of tensions. Be that as it may, you have the U.S., scheduled to build what will be one of the largest U.S. embassies in the world, with over 1,000 staff. You have cooperation going forward across a variety of fronts. These countries have come an enormously long way in a short period of time. So I think that conditions are ripe for certainly an upgrade in the scope of cooperation. Furthermore, we're in a very tense geopolitical moment, as you well know, in Taiwan.
Is there something perhaps on the Vietnamese side where they are worried or concerned about the reaction from China?
I don't really think that that's a huge concern. China and Vietnam have a special relationship by virtue of the affinities of their political systems and at least the formal levels of camaraderie. I think the Communist Party of Vietnam, like China's Communist Party, are committed to maintaining a situation of political supremacy. So I don't think that aspect is in doubt. I don't think that Vietnam worries about Beijing's reaction. I think it crafts its own policy. The fundamental challenge and opportunity facing Vietnam is how it can leverage the U.S. relationship in a way that promotes Vietnam's aims, including independence, sovereignty, security.
We often hear about Vietnam as being a sort of replacement, I guess, for China in terms of foreign investment, manufacturing hub.
I mean, Vietnam's prospects are bright. The question is, how bright will they be? I mean, it's widely expected that Vietnam will have one of, or perhaps the fastest growing economy until 2050. Vietnam has a great opportunity, an historic, once in a century opportunity to benefit from some of the shifts that we're seeing with respect to, the world economy. As you just mentioned, it has a great opportunity to absorb some of the foreign direct investment that is now trying to find its way out of China.
So how do you see the US-Vietnam partnership developing? What are the next steps?
Rightly or wrongly, in the US right now, people simply want to move away from China. The China relationship is viewed as toxic. And so Vietnam, even among, critics, is viewed as a very appealing destination. And so I think the question is how well the two countries can coordinate their cooperation. And in this context, this very substantial expansion of the US diplomatic presence in Vietnam is interesting and something to watch. I think areas such as, investment, tourism, education, especially higher education, these are the critical areas that we can look at in the U.S.-Vietnam partnership. There's something special about the relationship between these two countries, despite the violent history of the 20th century.
That was Jonathan London of the Leiden Institute speaking to me earlier. Andrea, let me come to you first. So we heard there from Jonathan London that he doesn't think that Vietnam will be that concerned about China's reaction, given their special relationship. But do you think there would be a reaction from China that Hanoi would be concerned about if they took the US relationship up to comprehensive strategic partnership?
Yes, I'm a little bit reserved on Jonathan's comments on this because Vietnam traditionally they have a complicated relations with China. Sometimes it's in a competitive way. Sometimes it's in a cooperative way. But after all, China is Vietnam's largest trade partner. They cannot ignore the Chinese government's reaction on this matter. So the Hanoi government, they would be sending other officials to bridge the communications. I'm sure this is a frequent events, ongoing events, to make sure Beijing is okay with the development of new relations with the U.S. government.
There are actually reports, Andrea, that Xi Jinping himself will meet with the Vietnamese Secretary General.
Yeah, that's right. So I believe that Vietnam would never ignore China's reaction in this aspect. But of course, that Vietnam government is having this target and ambitions to develop Vietnam's economy, and especially in recent months, the decline of Vietnam's economic performance might make the government think more on the future trade partners, not just with the U.S., but also with China. After all, China is the largest market for Vietnamese business people. So it is not so easy to overlook how Hanoi would develop and continue to develop its relations with Beijing in the economic aspects and diplomatic aspect as well.
Professor, would you like to comment on that? Because it's interesting that, in fact, the US is Vietnam's largest export market. And as you talked about, in terms of the trade deficit is the largest with China. So does that give the US actually more leverage over Vietnam?
I think the reason I said that there's a possibility to conclude this kind of comprehensive strategic partnership between Vietnam and the United States. contents of that relationship matter. So they have something, yes, we have the comprehensive strategic partnership, but Vietnam will not allow the U.S. to station troops in Can Bay or bases, build a basis there, all right? So that could be something China really concerned, all right?
Yes, and of course, you know, despite this sort of commonality, you know, the common spirit or ideology in communism, yet China has, you know, threatened Vietnam in the South China Sea. Right now, we understand that it is building, developing, militarizing possibly a small disputed island in the Paracels, again, Triton Island, very close to Vietnam. So it is a very complicated relationship.
That is why I think Biden is coming on the right occasion from the U.S. perspective. So timing is very important.
Yes, so it's something that can be exploited
yeah,
at this
Vietnam
time.
needs some kind of a counterweight against China.
Actually, Professor, China and Vietnam have a special relationship, but there was also a war between the two countries.
Yeah, that was 1979 when Vietnam invaded Kampuchea. Then China got very mad, and China decided to invade Vietnam. So in that case, that was history. But both Chinese and Vietnamese are pragmatic when it comes to the strategic collaboration, because Vietnam knows Vietnam needs China's market as well as the U.S. market. So that is why Vietnam actually is, according to some source, Vietnam is very eager to get China's electricity and, if possible, high-speed railway. And now it's already, China completed in Laos, and the next would be Vietnam. So if Vietnam is able to get that high-speed railway project from China, in that case, Vietnam will have a better chance to enhance its economic relationship with our region as well as China.
Now, Professor, let's turn to Vietnam's relationship with Russia, another authoritarian state, another perhaps complicated history there. Now, Russia was the biggest arms supplier to Vietnam, but since the Ukraine war, of course, that has shifted. How would you say that relationship has changed?
I think for Vietnam, Vietnam wants to diversify its arms sources, imported arms sources. On the other hand, Vietnam also wants to produce their own arms, weapons. So in that case, there's need for Vietnam to diversify the sources of the arms and also get the technology. So now 30% of the Vietnam's imported arms from Russia. So the US, of course, is the other alternative. So that is why Vietnam, early this year has already invited U.S. to join its arms exhibition. Why? It's very likely Vietnam wants to get technology and weapons from the United States.
The relationship between Russia and Vietnam, do you think it has changed since the Ukraine war?
We will see that Vietnam is trying to purchase more military equipments and arms from the U.S. government. And the South China Sea conflicts, Vietnamese government has mentioned many times they need a peaceful way to settle this issue. But the problem is always there. But the Vietnamese politicians, some of them are reluctant to really deal with the issue with real actions. So the sea is a problem, a trouble sometimes. So with the relations with other countries, we see that the most important thing is that Vietnam is trying to play smart in this regard. They don't choose, they don't put all eggs in one basket. Then their relations with other countries, either with the U.S. or with China or with Russia, they would try to find a secure way and a secure distance.
And Professor, from what you've seen so far under the present leader, Vietnamese leader, do you believe that he is skillfully navigating between these powers?
Vietnam has been very shrewd when it comes to its diplomacy. So that's a traditional way. And Vietnam also has been able to deal with China in a very smart way so far. Okay, so this current leadership, in particular, the Secretary General Liu To-hai, he came from the ideology camp, so that is why he pays special attention to this. That means China's relationship. On the other hand, he also wants to have a better economic relationship with the United States. So in that case, he wants to also improve relations with the United States. That is why he has to take a very dedicated balancing act between the two superpowers. So that is why I just made the suggestion they might have some kind of a comprehensive strategic partnership without very strategic contents. That's would be the smart way.
Okay. Final thoughts, Professor Liu. Final thoughts on Biden's trip, on the potential upgrade, and on China's reactions.
This is very important for Biden because Biden is looking for the forthcoming November APEC summit in the United States. So it's very important to get this kind of comprehensive strategic partnership from Vietnam. In that case, U.S. This final touch. U.S. has already had the David Camp summit with Japan, South Korea. Okay, so that is why this is very important.
If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.